Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. This is the Takeout. I want to talk to you about something that a fascinating new documentary series on Netflix pursues. There's a lot of things it pursues, a tremendous amount of great territory covered in beautiful and granular detail, but I think it asks a central question. And I'm going to put the question to the director of this series. The question is this: are we in America sleepwalking through a second Cold War and thereby misreading, misunderstanding, devaluing the actual threat of nuclear war that we are currently facing? Brian Knappenberger can answer that. He's the director of Turning Point Series 2, The Bomb and the Cold War. Brian, it's great to have you with us. Many congratulations on this. That's our opening question. Are we?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for having us on the show. To answer that question, I mean, you're absolutely right. That is a central question for us. When we started this, we embarked on a 9-hour, 9-episode look at the Cold War. And, initially we were thinking a lot about nuclear weapons and where, the state of nuclear weapons now and what the treaties were like, and we're following that history. But I think probably 2 months into creating this is when Putin invaded Ukraine. And we're just absolutely stunned, like everybody was, looking at that footage. Tanks were rolling into Kyiv, assassination attempt on Zelensky's life, and Putin is telling a version of the Cold War story himself. He famously said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy in history. And his version was riddled with errors. So we understood that the story we were telling was very, very current, and we decided to sort of look at what was happening in Ukraine. I had made a film there before, and was just very interested in this sort of modern Ukrainian history. And we realized that's what we were doing. We were telling this kind of very, very current story, and then using that as a jumping off point to set the stage and go back in history and learn about how we got here.
We should remind ourselves, should we not, Brian, that Vladimir Putin talks openly about the use of nuclear weapons, battlefield or otherwise.
Yeah. He does, and it's a very interesting thing. I mean, that was apparent right from the beginning. This sort of nuclear saber rattling. I mean, even very, very recently, he's come out and talked about this. He talks about it in speeches. He's talked about it all over. This does, of course, reminds you of the Cold War, the kind of threat of nuclear weapons that are constantly kind of in the air. But there's also something kind of new about it. Even in the kind of worst moments of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, there was a lot of talk and bluster and all of that during those periods of time. Certainly, it's true about the 80s. No doubt that kind of thing has been a part of the Cold War. But, there was never this kind of open, I guess I would say almost like normalization of the use of nuclear weapons that we see now. We found these clips on Russian, state-controlled Russian television, where they're just openly joking about bombing London. And what kind of missile would it take to get rid of London? That sort of things. That is a new. When you go into this history and really look at it, this is new. We were never quite this sort of flippant or joking about these use during all that period of time. So we're, this is the Cold War in that sense, but it's also feels like we're in a very dangerous time.
It's almost a kind of video game conversation.
Yeah.
Like, what would that look like? How long would it take? And, as if the ruin that would come from that isn't actually real. And I credit you for many things in this documentary series, but one of the things I most credit you for is, for those who don't know or haven't spent any time to understand the visuals of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the visuals of not a nuclear attack, but a nuclear accident, Chernobyl, to let people see and hear from the voices of survivors the terror, trauma, and despair of what this really means.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those are some of the most powerful interviews in the series, and some of the most powerful interviews I've ever done. I think, I guess I wasn't quite aware before we started this how much of a living memory there is of Hiroshima. A lot of people still have memories of that day. One interview subject that we talked to, her brother had actually seen the bomb. The skies were clear. Of course, there were no other bombers or planes in the sky, and was just watching this lone bomber and actually saw kind of a glimmer in the sky when the bomb was dropped. I mean, it's really unbelievable. And then you hear the story of the days after, of the actual explosion itself, and then the days after, and it is really really powerful. I think that we've you know when the Soviet Union collapsed, I think we kind of forgot about this a little bit. I think we
Yeah.
decided maybe this wasn't as much of a threat, and we find ourselves now at a period of time where Trump has let the INF treaty lapse, and he slow rolled the introduction of a treaty, a really important treaty, the New START treaty, which President Biden signed only weeks into office. But that's really the last treaty that exists when it comes to nuclear weapons, and that's going to expire in about 2 years. So it's possible that we are right on the cusp of being, if for the first time in 50 years, not having any nuclear treaties that govern the deployment of nuclear weapons. It's a really frightening time that takes us back, um, many many decades, and really, undoes some of the great accomplishments of the Cold War, which are the creation of these treaties in the first place.
Worth noting, bipartisan accomplishments pursued by Democratic and Republican presidents of the United States. And
Yep.
not to mention something that the documentary also sheds light on. There's an aggressive modernization of nuclear weapons going on in this country and in Russia. That is to
Yep.
say, well, the ones that maybe aren't as up to capabilities as they need to be, we need to make sure they're as capable as possible. And we're investing several orders of billions of dollars on that here in this country, as are the Russians.
It's remarkable to be back at this period of time when we're both when both the Russians and the United States are modernizing, creating new nuclear weapons. Back in this period of shoring up nuclear capabilities, China, of course, is creating nuclear weapons at a pretty rapid pace. Um, so yeah, it's a little wild to be creating a series about the Cold War and going back and looking at these kind of lessons that we thought were learned from this period of time. And again, these are some of the great accomplishments of the Cold War. These periods of relative cool-headedness and diplomacy between the superpowers that we were able to achieve these treaties in the first place. INF treaty was a really big deal. These were short range, intermediate range nuclear weapons. Those are the weapons that particularly important for Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the weapons that hit the European capitals. You have Reagan and Gorbachev and Reykjavik talking about eliminating nuclear weapons from the face of the earth entirely.
Right.
That didn't happen, but these were accomplished. There's plenty of disturbing parts of the Cold War, but we've taken these moments of diplomacy, and they're almost all gone now.
Yeah, it feels, Brian, to me, and we're going to go to break here in a second, so I'll just say this and we'll pick it up on the other side. It feels to me as if we have all of the frightening and malignant technology and weaponry, but none of the apprehensions, or fewer of the apprehensions that we had for the last 30 or 40 years. The voice of
That
Brian
seems pretty
Knappenberger
accurate to me.
is our special guest. He is the director of Turning Point Series 2, The Bomb and the Cold War. 9 episodes on Netflix. Absolutely fantastic. More of our conversation in 1 second.
In Russia, it was, became a kind of disillusionment with democracy after a period in which there was a huge amount of enthusiasm.
Welcome back to the Takeout, continuing our conversation with Brian Knappenberger, director of The Bomb and the Cold War, second volume of the Turning Point series on Netflix. Yes, it will take you 9 hours, ladies and gentlemen. You don't have to do it in one night. You don't have to do it in one week. But I urge you, as a way to remember something that you might have experienced, depending on your age, or something you're not really that familiar with at all. This is as comprehensive and granular and as visually and informationally lush as you'll find anywhere on any platform. So that's just my commercial on behalf of Brian. No checks were involved in that
Thank you very
summation.
much.
Let's talk about Vladimir Putin, because the last 2 or 3 episodes lean very heavily into this biography. And I think the biography is enormously important because it also attaches itself, because Putin attaches himself to the origins of the Soviet Union itself, and that story of Greater Russia, which is even older than the Soviet Union.
That's right. I mean, Putin is famously a kind of a child of the Cold War himself. He was a KGB agent in Dresden around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. There's a famous line that he made that he did in a book with an extended interview with him, where he describes being a KGB agent when all these protests, where people were filling the streets in this kind of unbelievable moment before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and he describes calling Moscow for instructions, for guidance. What he wants to do is he wants to use force against these protesters. Remember, we're not that far removed from the Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese government actually did use deadly force against democracy protesters there. He describes calling Moscow, and the famous line is, "Moscow was silent." And that is significant to him. I mean, he's, I think, more or less decided that Moscow is not going to be silent anymore. But you're right. He, in speeches and in interviews and in lots of communications with him, he has people have had with him. He does speak about not just the Soviet borders, the kind of, but he has visions of a kind of Russian Empire that goes back even farther than that. And it is remarkable when you look at the history. And yeah, I guess episode 8 around is essentially a portrait of him and the rise of Putin. When you look at it, he's remarkably consistent in his vision. And I'm not sure we were listening at the time or took that seriously. We believed the Cold War was over. We celebrated that moment in the West, and but I don't think we were quite listening to what was happening in Russia after the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and to Putin himself when he took the stage as leader.
And it's very important, and I'm glad the documentary leans into this so much, that Putin and his appointment to the presidency from Boris Yeltsin was welcomed by many Russians. His early political role as president was embraced by many Russians because he had an answer. It was not a clean answer. It was an oftentimes corrupt answer, but he had an answer to the dissatisfaction that many Russians felt about the lived experience of free market democracy and capitalism after the collapse of the Soviet Union under Yeltsin. And that's an important part of this story. Putin doesn't get there entirely on his own. Certainly he's crafty, he's ambitious, but this sense of discontent is real and he harnesses it.
Absolutely. The collapse of the Soviet Union, I think, in the West, this was a moment of celebration. There was a famous book called The End of History.
Francis Fukuyama, yep.
Francis Fukuyama. And, George H.W. Bush in his State of the Union address, which we have a little, clip of in the series, it says the Cold War is over and we won, essentially. And that was the mentality. And I think that there were a lot of decisions made right after that that really started to set the stage for Russia in the 90s. And it was quite a key period of time. And what happened was, some of those decisions led to mass economic kind of unrest, difficulties in Russia. It was, became a kind of disillusionment with democracy after a period in which there was a huge amount of enthusiasm for democracy. That changes in a matter of 2-3 years, and suddenly people are They're having trouble,
Food shortages, rampant
food
inflation,
shortages,
unemployment, people
rapid,
living on the streets,
yeah.
all of these
And
sort of
so,
economic privations that the West sort of overlooks. And Robert Gates is very aggressive in his interview with you, former CIA director, defense secretary, saying, look, we missed it. We missed this entirely. We just assumed everything would be fine, and we blew it.
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. His interview in particular really was sort of, I think, self-reflective in a way. I hadn't really heard that much. He really did say we did drop the ball on a lot of things. There was a kind of opportunity here that was missed, and part of that is the George H.W. Bush famously said, I don't do the vision thing. It's a heck of a time for a leader in the United States not to have the vision thing.
Right.
Clinton comes in, and it's the economy, stupid. So we are readjusting our focus post Cold War, and at that period of time, and it was a period of time in which it was just a very, very delicate period of time for a new Russia, and it was very, very difficult decade, and that's the landscape. That's the stage that Putin enters.
And there's also a discussion, and I want to dwell on this for a second, how the invasion of Iraq changes the calculus of Putin and creates a kind of answer that Putin always has to accusations that he's acting aggressively and he's violating international law.
Yes, it's a very, very interesting moment. He is Putin is famously, he's one of the first people to call President George W. Bush after 9/11. He does believe there's some common ground, I think, when it comes to fighting, in a very general sense, fighting terrorism and how he sees that in the world. But then there's a split with Iraq, and that becomes a talking point for Putin throughout, including very recently. So yeah, this becomes a the hour, and it's one of those discussion points that I think people have to kind of reckon with a little bit. I mean, what was the United States doing in Iraq? How does that relate to what Putin's doing, trying to do here?
And Brian,
These are different
something that
things,
also
but
comes
yeah.
across from Putin, which is a kind of deeply rooted, though not always inaccurate, cynicism about the core instincts of the West.
True. Mike McFall has a lot to say about that in this, and
Yeah.
I think it's really insightful. I mean, he does believe that his vision of us is that we're driven by money, and
we can always be bought off, basically. Yeah.
We can always be bought off. Yes. So there is a kind of deep cynicism there that he has about the West. It's in completely woven into every speech he gives. It is a primary thing that he talks about.
I want to ask you a basic question. Was there anyone you wanted to get for this that you didn't get? Because I am astonished by all the range of people you have in this documentary.
Thanks. Yeah, there was one that I really wanted to get that we did not get. I really want to talk to Hillary Clinton about this. I really wanted to do an interview with her. Putin believed that Hillary was involved with, and maybe even in a secret message in one of her speech, touched off the protests against Putin when he took power again after Medvedev. He has a deep-seated hatred for Hillary Clinton. She had a couple of really fascinating interactions with him where he told personal stories that are interesting and seem to speak to his motivation, but at the same time, you wonder if they're even true. So I felt like she had a really interesting perspective that I wanted to hear, and she just didn't want to do an interview.
All right, so one got away, ladies and gentlemen, but nobody else
Just
did.
one,
I guarantee
just one.
you. I guarantee you, one
114
got
other
away.
ones.
Voice of Brian Knappenberger, the Netflix series, second series of Turning Point, The Bomb in the Cold War. More of our conversation in 1 second.
If you look at Putin's actions since he came to power, he has been talking about Ukraine. He has been thinking about Ukraine. He and Medvedev have both made comments that it's not a real country.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Brian Knappenberger, the director of The Bomb and the Cold War, Turning Point Series 2 on Netflix. It's absolutely fantastic. It is worth all 9 hours, I promise you. You mentioned Mike McFaul, ambassador to Russia. He said something in the documentary that I've long believed and I've fretted about, Brian, as it regards Ukraine. That the West will never care about Ukraine as much as Putin and Russia does. And that, to quote Mike McFaul, I believe quoting Russian speaking to him, you, the West, have a short attention span. We don't. I've read about both of those. I think they're true.
Yeah, I mean, yes. The minute I heard that, I had the ring of truth, doesn't it? I mean, I think this is what I think Putin may have said this to him directly in a meeting. He says, "Look, we care about this. This is a part." And if you look at Putin's actions since he came to power, he has been talking about Ukraine. He has been thinking about Ukraine. He and Medvedev have both made comments that it's not a real country. They don't believe it's a real country.
That's false, but that doesn't mean they don't believe it.
That's right. So, this is this absolutely has a ring of truth.
An uncomfortable ring of truth to me.
Span. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, democracy in Ukraine. I made a film in Ukraine in 2004, and I was just impressed with the democratic movement there, and have always kind of been interested in it, and it's a really, really kind of powerful kind of instinct there, this independence and the democratic movement. So this is a really big deal. That supporting Ukraine is a very, very big deal for us. But as you can see, House Republicans have blocked aid packages to Ukraine now. Putin seems to be emboldened by this. Several cities have fallen recently. You wonder if that line is right.
So I want to ask you about two names, neither of which appear in the documentary, but I think you'll be familiar with and can either link together as I do intellectually, or maybe not. Walter Duranty and Tucker Carlson.
That sounds like another documentary. That sounds good.
You and I, we'll work on it, okay?
That's the next project. I mean, look, yeah, sure. Well, maybe I could just talk about Tucker a little. He of course did the interview with Putin. He talked about how journalists are supposed to ask hard questions, and then I think he just let Putin kind of do what he wanted to with him. So
even to the point where Putin got bored.
Yeah, when Putin says, "I thought those questions were going to be harder," you've really kind of rolled over. That's.
And then he goes to a supermarket and all this other stuff about the glories of what a consumer can find in Russia, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring up Walter Duranty for those who don't know, because this is covered in the documentary, the famine in Ukraine, government enforced by Joseph Stalin. Walter Duranty was a correspondent in Russia, in the Soviet Union. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage, and many in retrospect have looked at that coverage as unnecessarily non-journalistically fawning, tolerant, and offering no end of excuses for Stalinism in general, Ukraine in particular. That's why I put those two names somewhat together.
Yeah, I mean, it does. You can see that when we put this together, there's time and time again, you're looking at these kind of similarities, and every turn of the story seems to have some kind of modern relevance to it. Yeah, but at the height of the Ukrainian famine, we're getting stories about it's very similar. It's we're getting stories about how it's working. The communist system is working.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about a very dramatic part of the documentary series, with some recordings I'm not sure I know I've never heard before. They might have been released someplace. They probably have, but it was vivid to see them here about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the conversations inside the White House. Jack Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Robert McNamara as defense secretary, and what a perilous time that was, and how diplomacy unwound that watch.
Yeah, that is really. I mean, when you add the stakes that the world, this is a potential world-ending moment. Those conversations, when you are hearing inside the White House as all of this is going down, are really stirring. You can in particular, I think what you come away with that is the Robert Kennedy kind of role in all of that, which wasn't quite understood as much at the time. The way that he sort of took this bigger picture and kind of tried to kind of hold back this. Part of it's the generals and how sort of hyped up that you feel, how ready they are to go to war, and really only kind of thinking about it in directly military terms. But of course, one of the big things about the Cuban Missile Crisis is it wasn't clear to everybody at the time, and really for a while after, how it ended with the kind of taking missiles out of Turkey and all of that. That actually wasn't clear. The story we were told is that Kennedy stood up and they blinked,
And
but
Khrushchev
it was a
backed
lot more
down.
complicated
Exactly.
than that.
Yeah. It was
Yeah.
much more complicated. I think the movie 13 Days gives a dramatic but pretty accurate retelling of that and Robert Kennedy's vital role. It's dramatized for sure, and dramatized at a very high level, I will say. I think it's a really good movie. It captures a lot of this, which is verified by the recordings that the documentary gives ample voice to. We got about a minute 30 before we go to break. Brian, talk to me about the project from the origins of the atomic age and what you were trying to convey to people.
Well, the nuclear element of this was always really, really important to me. I have a personal connection to nuclear weapons that I can talk about, but really, I think that the invention of nuclear weapons was so profound. It's such a profound and turning point in history that it really changed everything that came after. I mean, the invention of nuclear weapons changed politics and the economy, and it was a different world after humans had world destroying weapons than it was before. And I think that's the movie Oppenheimer obviously is a great movie and dramatizes those early tests, the Trinity tests and others. But this is a story that is about those reverberations from that invention. And so, we look at, this is a story of the human race after we did, create a world destroying weapon, a weapon to destroy all life on Earth. How does that ripple through the rest of our society? And that's a Cold War story, but that's also the tension we're feeling now.
How does it shape culture? How does it shape attitudes? How does civilization exist on a constant axis of fear? Those are all embedded realities of the Cold War, and we may be revisiting them more rapidly and more profoundly than we currently realize. Segment 4 of the Takeout coming your way after this break. Brian Knappenberger is our special guest.
Khrushchev, had comments that said, we're building missiles like sausages.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Brian Knappenberger is our special guest. He is the director of The Bomb and the Cold War, Netflix series, part of the Turning Point approach to documentary storytelling. 9 hours, worth every single minute. How about some of the things? Well, first of all, you said something a minute ago that sticks in my head. You said you have a personal connection to nuclear weapons. What is that?
I grew up in a small town called Broomfield, Colorado, which is the closest community to a nuclear weapons creating facility called Rocky Flats. When I was young, they told us that they made the trigger to nuclear weapons there, but the trigger to a thermonuclear device is a nuclear weapon, and they assembled it. They built the bomb there. They were lying to us. And so, I grew up not quite knowing what was going on 10 miles away from where I lived. A couple of times, that Rocky Flats burned to the ground. When weapons grade plutonium comes in contact with air, it simultaneously combusts. So it's obviously very volatile. And always there was kind of rumors and stories about how the water might be contaminated with radiation, or the soil around our houses might be contaminated with radiation. And that's the water I drank. That's the water I swam in. That's the dirt I played in as a kid. So I kept kind of that always stayed in the back of my mind. It's the first time I was ever aware of Daniel Ellsberg. He when I was young, they came to Rocky Flats and there were protests there. So I kind of understood something was happening there. It was run by a military contractor called Rockwell and
Mhm.
the government, and this was just all very secretive, and we didn't know. And radiation is a weird kind of threat. You can't smell it, you can't see it, you can't feel it. It's deadly, and so it was a very very weird thing. I mean, it's not too much for me to say that's why I make documentary films. Um, it's this notion that there's a sort of danger or something happening in a community in which you're not being told the full story, and you want to find out. You want to find this mix of anger, and you want to find out
Mhm.
more about what's happening. And I think that's it was just a kind of big deal. I guess it's the most profound way that the Cold War kind of reached into my childhood.
And there are really amazing and heartbreaking stories in the documentary early on about above ground testing of nuclear weapons
Mm,
in New Mexico and a dance camp that's in range of the fallout, not only
yeah.
from the sky in terms of things that are coming down on these girls who are at a dance camp. They think it's snow, but it's too warm to be snow, and they start rubbing it on their face. It's actually radioactive ash or byproduct. In the Bikini Atoll, there are those who are there who are in the not knowing they're in the range, who are
Mhm.
affected, who die, who develop radiation poison. Those are all real world consequences of this early stage of research.
Yeah. The girls' dance school really was a powerful story for me when I first heard it. I didn't realize
I mean, it
there were
is
people that
so
close to the.
so gut wrenching to listen to and to see.
Yeah. Yeah, they sort of their thinking was that it's summer, maybe that's why this snow is hot. They describe that the explosion, which happened very, very early in the morning in the dark, one of the girls' ways of describing it was that the sun came up tremendous, and
Yeah.
it's pretty powerful. So we named the first episode that, but yeah, they had no idea what was going on. Obviously, it was secretive, um, and I believe only one of those girls lived to the age of 30.
There's also an important part of the documentary, and it's been treated in films and documentaries, but I don't think can be treated too many times. That is the Red Scare, the sense of paranoia that grips the United States in the 50s, and the political manipulations and misinformation that go with that.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that you can't help but try to draw parallels to our modern day. Yeah, this fear, this kind of fear that was created by this demagogue McCarthy, and the way that he manipulated this moment for his own personal gain. Of course, with his henchman Roy Cohn, who shows up later in history in all sorts of ways. Um, this is a scary period where America turns on itself, and when the fear and anger that we have, both about nuclear weapons, really fosters this kind of division that I think is a part of our world now.
And there's one other aspect that I found very, very interesting. I knew a little bit about it, but I learned even more from the documentary. So in the 1960 presidential campaign, there was a conversation engaged by both sides, Republican and Democrat. The Republican nominee, Richard Nixon, Democratic nominee, John F. Kennedy, that there's a missile gap in America, and it's a terrible thing. And Eisenhower has been asleep at the switch, and what are we going to do? There is no missile gap. It's the exact opposite, but both parties buy into this. And undergirding that, the documentary argues and buttresses itself by words from none other than the outgoing president of the United States. The military-industrial complex is in on it.
Yeah. This is one of the big revelations of the U-2 flights, the planes that we were able to send over the Soviet Union. There was always this notion that there's a missile gap, that we were behind, that the Soviets were building missiles quickly. Khrushchev fostered this too. I mean, Khrushchev, had comments that said, we're building missiles like sausages. But this turned out to be bluster. When we really got, the United States is very good at technological surveillance, especially through this period of time. Not as good as at human intelligence, but but once we sort of understood what was really happening, I think we had 4,000 missiles at the time, and we thought the Soviets were way ahead of us. It turns out they had 4 missiles. It was this massive missile gap, but it was
not 40, not 400, 4.
Yeah, 1,000 to 1 in our favor. But yeah, you make a great point. How does this play out in the political sphere? Once they know that, both parties are still playing the missile gap in order to get elected. And Kennedy was almost assuredly made aware that was the case. But Democrat, Republican, it didn't matter. This was how you got elected.
There are so many amazing revelatory stories of the Cold War. It sweeps across 7 decades in American history. And Turning Point, The Bomb and the Cold War, touch on all of them memorably, precisely, with every voice you'd ever want. Yes, we know there's one voice that got away, Hillary Clinton. Okay, but besides that, every voice you can think of, I guarantee you, is there. Brian Knappenberger is the director. It's been our great pleasure to talk to you, sir. Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial. We'll see you next week, folks.
I love classical music. I guess I've been listening to a lot of soundtracks recently.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. We're doing this, of course, from the CBS News Bureau, 3rd floor. It's our very cool studio. Hope you always enjoy the studio and our Zoom experience. We do this every now and again when it's required, and it is for this particular conversation. Brian Knappenberger, director of Turning Point. That's the series on Netflix. This particular documentary, The Bomb and the Cold War, 9 episodes. Don't miss a one. That's all I'm going to say. Brian, we have 3 questions we ask everyone on this program. We've been doing this program. I've been doing this program for the better part of 8 years. So take these questions in whichever order you prefer. Most influential book in your life and why? If you're on a long flight and long drive, you're going to listen to some music you thoroughly enjoy. What kind of artist or genre is that most likely to be? And if you have a favorite movie, tell our audience what your favorite movie is.
Ooh, the movie's tough.
Yeah, I would imagine.
All of those are tough. Oh my God. How am I supposed to start with this? You realize in advance these are impossible questions to answer. So I suppose that's why you're doing it.
That's why my audience enjoys it so much. Yes, yes.
I'm going to go with the book. I don't know if it's the most influential, but I think about it a lot. Is the Graham Greene book, The Quiet American? Mm-hmm. That book is a very good. I mean, it's a scripted narrative. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm a truth-based sort of person, but this is a narrative book. It's about history, and it's about this specific moment in history, and it tells that moment very, very well. And it's got this incredible parallel to a personal story that just works exactly right with that moment in history. And so the artistry of that book, I just think is really, really powerful. And it's something I do think about a lot when you think about how does a personal story, how do you create a gripping personal story that has a broader relevance to it too? And I think that Graham Greene really does that well in The Quiet American.
Excellent,
So
excellent.
that's the one I'll have to pick for that one. Wait, what are the rest of this? What
Movie and music.
music do you movie and music? I'm a fan of movie. That's a movie. I got to pick a movie. I'm a filmmaker. This is an impossible. You know what I'm going to go? You know what I'll go with All the President's Men.
Okay, great. Yeah.
All the President's Men is gripping from the minute you turn it on until the end. It is a wonderfully crafted movie. If you love history, of course, and you're a history geek, you're engaged. But it's also similar to Graham Greene. You're really drawn into the. You're really drawn into the personal story and this quest that they have to find the truth there, trying to overcome it. You understand the whole time what's at stake. You feel like you're in the action the whole time. As a filmmaker, I'm always amazed that I think the first 20 minutes doesn't have any music in it at all,
Right. Exactly.
which is something that you would love. That's just a sign of good filmmaking.
Mhm.
And then of course when it kicks in, it's like you can't stay in it hits you so much you fall over in your chair. So that is it. That is in particular a really powerful
Right. The
movie.
first sound you hear is a
Um,
typewriter key hitting the paper, and it sounds like a gunshot.
it really does. The sound, the way the music is, the drama, the acting is fantastic. The story itself, of course, is this iconic story that you're learning along the way. I mean, it's a gripping and great accomplishment.
Music.
I'd love to do something like that. Music is also painful. How about? I love classical music. I guess I've been listening to a lot of soundtracks recently. That's another thing that I maybe an effect of the trade I'm in, but I do love soundtracks, orchestral soundtracks. I love I love old punk stuff too. I love Tom Waits. I could mix it up. I often will if I'm doing something of a particular, if for some reason the documentary goes into some decade, I will indulge in that decade pretty heavily.
I
But
can
yeah,
totally relate to
music
that.
is yeah,
First Tom Waits reference on our program, and I dig Tom Waits too. So
good.
Brian Knappenberger,
Yeah.
thanks very much for your time. We'll see you next week, folks.